Do artists need to be biblically fluent? In this episode, I talk with Douglas McKelvey. He's the guy who wrote all of these every moment holy books of liturgies and prayers about all kinds of things, from drinking coffee in the morning to prayers for people who have lost their loved ones. In it, he describes to us how he came to Nashville and began a community of artists who learned how to think more theologically and coherently about their art, which means learning how to think more biblically about their art. So we talked to Doug. We asked him where he gets the gall to script rituals for people in the Christian tradition and how he approaches that task faithfully. Stay tuned.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
So, while I am not an employee of the Rabbit Room, I would say I am very much a beneficiary of what the Rabbit Room is. I think it's been probably a 15-year journey or so from the beginning of the Rabbit Room, when author and recording artist Andrew Peterson had the initial idea for it as he was sitting in the Eagle and Child pub, sitting in the Rabbit Room in the back, which was the room where the Inklings, where Tolkien and Lewis and Charles Williams and other friends of theirs would meet every week to have fellowship together, to share what they were working on. And
Which
at
you
that,
no longer sit in, by the way, because the Eagle and Child are closed, but it's being refurbished right now. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to go over to, what's the other one?
Lamb and Flag. Across the street,
yeah.
Which is much more a university bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Andrew was sitting there and ruminating on the role that friendship had played in the creation of these redemptive cultural artifacts that have had so much impact. And he started to consider the question of, is this something we could replicate in Nashville? I mean, we have all these friends who are novelists, writers, pastors, theologians, recording artists, songwriters, visual artists. Could we not do something intentional in order to encourage one another, to foster those relationships and to see an increase of those sorts of redemptive cultural artifacts that might be birthed organically out of those relationships? So he came back to the States very excited. And this was probably 5 years before I even met him. I was not even on the radar with the Rabbit Room at this point. But he pitched the vision for this to his brother Pete. And Pete got really excited about it, and they started brainstorming all these ideas of, a destination bookstore and a coffee shop, and then reality set in, and they realized, well, we have zero budget to do any of that, so let's start a blog. So,
which is what you did 15 years ago.
Yeah, so that's what they purchased the domain name rabbitroom.com, and they started inviting friends to contribute essays. And so it pretty quickly turned into a thing where almost daily there was a new essay posted. And within a few years, you had this very robust discussion that was happening on the site. It was, I would say it became the closest thing to actual online community that I've seen. You fast forward to today, there are so many thousands of people involved that it's lost some of that.
Right.
intimacy of community and people really engaging with one another and caring about one another and getting to know each other. I mean, that's still very much part of the DNA of the Rabbit Room, but in terms of what happens on the blog and the discussion, that was one of the casualties of the rapid growth of the Rabbit Room. But those people who had begun to form this sort of community online began to clamor for an opportunity to get together. They wanted a conference. And Andrew and Pete initially said, "No way, we're never going to do that."
Okay.
But as voices continued to be very persistent, eventually some of those voices were also persuasive, and they said, "Okay, we'll try this." So they limited it to 250 attendees or so because they didn't want something that would be so large that it wouldn't have a personal, intimate relationship kind of feel. And that went really well, and that became an annual event, and something that the tickets now sell out within about 2 minutes of going on sale. So then there's, a perpetual waiting list of people hoping someone else drops out so they can get in. The Rabbit Room now does a Hutchmoot UK, which was at Oxford the first couple of years. Now it's been moved to the Hayes Conference Center up in Swanwick, kind of the middle of the country. And Rabbit Room Press was begun early on with the idea that, hey, this isn't something we anticipate we're going to make money on really, but there are certain books that none of the established publishers are going to touch, but that we think should exist in the world. So, we want to publish those books and make them available to whoever the audience might be for them. So Rabbit Room Press is something that started small and that has grown tremendously. Then a few years ago, the Rabbit Room built Northwind Manor, so there's now actually this destination place, place of hospitality, place where the staff of the Rabbit Room and Rabbit Room Press work there as well. It's open every Wednesday afternoon for an open house, and so you can go there, get your tea or coffee and whatever homemade snacks Rachel, the hospitality coordinator, who's an amazing chef, has created. And you can go take a book from Madeleine L'Engle's library, which was donated to the Rabbit Room, and sit beside Tolkien's fireplace, the actual fireplace from his bedroom during the time he was writing Lord of the Rings. And you can drink your coffee, have a conversation, take your selfie in front of Tolkien's fireplace. And
how did you manage to get Tolkien's fireplace? Was there a negotiation, or was it like someone just went in the middle of the night and pried it out?
There was a bit of negotiation, which again, I was not a part of it. Andrew has become a bit of a collector of artifacts of Tolkien, of Lewis, of Chesterton. Mm-hmm. And he was scouring eBay and saw that someone was auctioning off this fireplace from Tolkien's bedroom. So he contacted the guy just saying, "Hey, I can't afford this thing, but we have this nonprofit organization. If it would make sense from your standpoint to donate it." And the guy, who was living in the Wheaton area, responded, and he was like, "Oh, I'm a huge fan of yours.
Oh, nice.
I have too much invested in this to be able to just give it away, but I can make you a great deal on it. I can, cut the price way down from what I'm asking on eBay. I would love for you to have it for Northwind Manor." And I think the story had been that in Oxford, a family had purchased Tolkien's former home, decided they wanted to modernize and update everything, so they just parceled it out, sold off the pieces. This guy had bought the fireplace, had it shipped across the Atlantic on an actual ship, and so had it in storage there at Wheaton and had thought he was going to use it for something, but then, that didn't pan out, so he was selling it. So that's...
The Brits don't quite have the same romantic fascination with Tolkien and Lewis that Americans tend to as well. And they tear down old buildings or rebuild them, put modern kitchens in old buildings every day, that were 300 years old. So,
right. Which is not that old to them.
No, of course not.
Because there are 1,000-year-old buildings or older.
Yeah. So maybe we can take a step back from the rabbit room, and I'm interested because you moved to Nashville if I remember correctly, to work with Charlie Peacock. Is that right, in the art house?
Yes.
So explain that whole movement, and let me frame it biographically for me. I went to Covenant Seminary and learned about Francis Schaeffer. And I was blown away because, I was in a punk band in the 80s in Tulsa, and, I was really big into that scene. And then I'm reading this guy, in the early 2000s, who's this theologian who's explaining to me how punk music works philosophically. And I was like, whoa, I didn't even know that. And I was in the movement, And then later I found out that this guy that I knew in Tulsa, Nick Bure, was reading Francis Schaeffer. So how did you get connected? Even because you came out of, can we go ahead and say the name of the university? Oral Roberts University.
Yeah.
Oral Roberts University doesn't lend itself towards a natural, a glide into Francis Schaeffer, I guess.
Right.
Maybe it does. I don't know.
Right. Well, I suppose in a counterintuitive way it did for me. I grew up in some interesting theological circles from the time I was 6 years old to 15, probably. My family was part of a small church that was a neo-Pentecostal charismatic, pretty close to a personality cult. Was not a healthy place. And then, my last couple years of high school, we went to a church that was balanced by comparison and had a lot of very sincere Jesus followers there. And that was the season in my life when the Spirit of God first began to stir in my heart and draw me to Him. But it still was not a place that corrected a lot of the bad theology that I had been exposed to. I would say it corrected some of it, but it also it left a lot of gaps. So at the time that I went to college, I walked into a place where there was a lot of prosperity teaching, and I was very wide-eyed and accepting when I walked in. But it was within 6 to 8 weeks of being there my freshman year that all of that just came tumbling down. It just fell apart. And I found myself in a place where I was pretty sure that there were people teaching things that were not accurate, that were not true, that were not right. But I did not have any kind of theological foundation on which to really judge or to be discerning. It was just this intuitive thing of, I'm pretty sure that sounds wacky.
Smells funny, right?
Yeah, but I don't know what to replace it with. So it became a very leveling experience for me, that there were all of these bad ideas that just got, whatever had been built there got torn down back to this basic foundation, where I think in my senior year at the university there, the last real prayer that I prayed that year was, God, I still believe in you, and I believe that Jesus is your son. I don't know what's true beyond that, and these ideas are being thrown at me so fast from every angle, and I don't have any way to sort through them. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to kind of step back and check out a little bit until I'm out of this place, and then maybe we can meet up again.
It's not you, it's me.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not trying to argue for that prayer as a model, but it was at the time an honest cry of my heart. And I know we can be honestly wrong and honestly deceived about things, but that was very much what happened. That it was only after I had been out of those circles for some time and just kind of not even really trying to sort through anything, but that I found myself in a place again where I wasn't on the defensive, and where my heart could be open again to the movement of God's Spirit, and moving me from that place of, it was this necessary leveling of all this garbage and just sweeping that away. And then, it was 2 or 3 years after that before I was actually in a place where, in hindsight, I can see how, I landed in Nashville in a church that became kind of a triage center for me. And I think it was for a lot of people at the time, that it was just this place of healing, but also of, for the first time in my life, someone was articulating a coherent view of Scripture, of all of Scripture, as being one thing, as opposed to just cherry picking verses here and there and building these odd theologies out of a particular verse, as opposed to letting the whole of Scripture interpret individual scriptures. So at the time that I moved to Nashville, it was in the midst of that kind of transition for me from having my previous theological ideas leveled and kind of waiting to see where do I go from here? What gets built in its place?
Can I stop you there for a second?
Yes.
Just because this seems so apropos to what you see today with a lot of people doing, they'll call this deconstructing now. And so I wonder what you think of those movements, as much as people who've gone through that, compared to what you went through. Is it the same thing, or is it something different you see today?
Well, I wouldn't want to paint everyone who uses that term with the same brush. I think there's a lot of nuance there. And I think that people use the word differently. And some of what, passes for or is labeled by people as a process of deconstruction in their own lives, I don't have a lot of patience for. And
let's go ahead and name that. What? Because I think I know what you're talking about. But.
Well, I think there's something that's become very faddish, like this elevation of doubt, to say that, oh, you know, you're not being authentic and honest if you're not being sort of driven by your doubts, and by, you know, that there's no real certainty to be had. And I don't look back at what I experienced and link it to that kind of deconstruction. It was something that happened to me. It was like, you know, a bulldozer was just, you know, came right through the trailer park and took out the place I was staying.
Yeah.
You know?
No,
and I dove out the window and landed on the concrete slab, and that was all that was left there. And so, you know, I think yes, we are to be engaging constantly with our Creator in these conversations that involve honest articulations of our fears, of our insecurities, of our disappointments with, you know, the way we thought God would do this or should do this, and he didn't. And there are those moments of real doubts, whether it's just a passing thing that I feel this hour, or if it's a season that I have to wrestle through for months or even years. Those things are real, and we have the model in the Psalms and in some of the prophets of, you know, that yes, those very things are invitations to conversation and to relationship with our Creator. And we don't need to cover those things up. We don't need to hide them. But I don't see that much of what goes under the name of deconstruction lately is actually that.
Right.
And I'm no authority in any way on this. I mean, you know, what I'm stating are just my opinions based on my observations, but just kind of on a gut level, there's something that I see happening there, a dynamic that I just don't have any desire to engage in.
Yeah. I sometimes I have a very similar gut reaction to it. It sometimes feels to me very similar to students who take a Bible class, like an Old Testament or New Testament class with me. And when I kind of bring up the natural complexities of the biblical text, they latch onto those as like reasons they don't have to believe it anymore. And it becomes like a pry bar for them to be able to go back home and see, like, the text isn't doing what you thought it was doing, Mom and Dad, or something like that. And I sometimes get those vibes from some of these. I'm judging basically on the self-report of people who are doing this deconstructing and putting it out there in public. So it's a very selective sample, but hopefully not a model for everybody. So, okay, you got your slab leveled, and then you end up in Charlie Peacock, the art house. That's a pretty interesting place to end, like where you were coming from and where you were at in life. That's a very peculiar place to land.
There were always things I was hungry for, right? Even in those times of confusion. And Charlie Peacock himself was a very interesting thread woven through certain parts of my life. During those years when I wasn't sure what to believe, there was this artist whose music I loved, and who for whatever reason would come to Dallas frequently, which was about 5 hours drive from Tulsa.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so my roommate Nick and I would drive down to see him. He would play there maybe 3 times a year, and we would always wait in the line at his table till the end, till everyone else had left, so we could talk to him. And he was one of my lifelines in that when I would see him do a concert, the things he would share from the stage, the honesty, the integrity, the way he wore his Christianity was so appealing. I was just hungry for it. It was like, there's something real here that I haven't gotten a lot of the places that I've been. And so there really was something about him in particular that was one of those little catalysts that kept me believing, that kept me hanging on, that, okay, there's somewhere to get to. There's something to say. I'm not quite sure how to articulate what it is that I see in him, but there's something there that I want, and I want that kind of faith. So when out of the blue, he extended the invitation to Nick Beret and to me to move to Nashville to be a part of helping to launch the Art House Foundation, this new nonprofit venture that Charlie and his wife Andy were in the process of starting. It was unbelievable.
Right.
And
You're just
to this,
fans, right?
Yeah. And to this day, if you ask Charlie why he invited us, because he didn't know us, we had a few conversations. He'll just kind of shrug and be like, I don't know, I just kind of had a instinct about it.
Seemed good at the time. I needed some worker bees. You guys look like worker bees.
Yeah. So, of course we both said yes. He was one of our heroes at the time. So we moved to Nashville, and those early days of the Art House, those early years, were so important in the formation of my thinking, because not only did the Art House, in a very consciously, sit on the shoulders of the Schaeffers and of Labrie, and of Francis Schaeffer's thinking about culture and art, and of Edith Schaeffer's thinking about hospitality and family and service. But there were also these direct connections, like a guy named Marvin Paget, who had lived and served on the staff of, I can't remember if it was Swiss Labrie or one of the others for a couple years, but who was still on the board of directors for the Schaeffer Foundation, but now lived in Nashville. He almost immediately, when the Art House opened, started teaching a weekly systematic theology class.
Oh, interesting.
And as it turns out, only 3 people went to it, and that was Nick and me and my wife, Lisa. We had just gotten married. So it was actually a few months into, Nick and I moved to Nashville in April. My wife and I got married in December. But, within that first year, we were the beneficiaries of that. And there were other conferences and classes and gatherings and talks from just outstanding and thoughtful speakers and theologians and artists. So it was an amazing place to land. It was exactly what I needed on so many levels. And then it's interesting now, the last 10 years, the involvement I've had with the Rabbit Room, a much younger organization, But the Rabbit Room is very conscious of the debt it owes to Charlie and Andy and the art house and the work there. So it's like you have this generational build of Labrie and all the work the Schaeffers did, funneling into the art house, and what Charlie and Andy did there, funneling into the Rabbit Room and the work that the Rabbit Room is doing. So, so I kind of feel like I've been along for the ride for multiple decades here of how those streams that begin with Francis and Edith Schaeffer have made their way, down to the present day.
Yeah, and to close the circle here with my own story and how I know you and Nick. So I go to Covenant. I have my mind blown by Francis Schaeffer teaching under Jerem Bars, and I just can't believe it. And at some point I was telling, where you talk about your story, and I was like, yeah, I wasn't really raised Christian. I kind of was, but not really. And but there's this guy at church who was a youth group leader, and he used to have like rock bands at the church, but they weren't playing Christian music. They were just like playing whatever. And then when I finally met Nick and I just asked him, I was like, yeah, what was that all about? Like, where did you get that idea? And he told me, I was listening to this guy, Charlie Peacock. He turned me on to Francis Schaeffer. And I was like, oh, okay. The same thing that blew your mind back then just blew my mind, 20 years later. So it was wild that two people coming out of charismatic circles in Tulsa, Oklahoma ended up kind of in a very theologically similar place. What was the art house? Like physically, what was it, an actual house or an office?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah. So, there were the entire Christian music industry pretty much in the early 90s relocated from Southern California to Nashville.
Okay.
So the labels did that, most of the big labels. A lot of the artists did so as well. And Charlie was one of those. And he and his wife, probably a couple of years, or maybe it wasn't even that long after they had relocated to Nashville, they discovered that this old Methodist church up on the hill, that they would drive past on their way to and from their house all the time, and had sort of joked about, what if that was ever for sale? Suddenly there was a for sale sign in front of it. And so they ended up buying it. And they already had the stirrings of this vision for the art house, for a place that would be a place of hospitality and a place where people could gather to make this shared journey of what it means to exist at this intersection of art and faith. And I think at the time, Charlie recognized a real need that still exists today, but that, at least in some circles and churches, has been addressed because of the work of the art house and all of the works that rippled out of that over the years. But he was so aware of, at the time, of this crisis for artists in the church, artists in whatever sort of medium, that most churches had no idea what to do with artists or their gifts. Either they were just sort of ostracized and shunned and looked at as like, well, what you're doing doesn't really have anything to do with the kingdom of God, or They were looked at in a very utilitarian sense that, you can use your abilities as a brilliant painter to make signs to advertise our youth retreat, but this impoverishment, that foundationally is theological, but there was this real lack of understanding of the place of beauty
Mm-hmm.
and wonder in our formation as spiritual beings, who are physically, who are, embodied and spiritual beings who are making this journey towards our Creator. So that was a big part of what the art house was setting out to address, but also to provide a coherent theological foundation for artists who were coming from so many different backgrounds. And, I was a good example of someone who landed there, not having a lot of stuff that was making sense to me at the time. I was very much in need of that kind of consistency of teaching and of consideration of things from a scriptural foundation, the way that Schaeffer was so talented at doing and providing, to be able to look at any issue from the standpoint of I think he called it thinking Christianly.
Right.
Maybe was that a Schaeffer term? Yeah. So that was all new to me, as was in those early days, Charlie was really thinking and talking a lot about the idea of coram Deo, of all of life lived under the gaze of God, of there being no separation between secular and sacred, and of all parts of life being lived as an act of ongoing worship. And so that became very foundational and formational to my thinking and my theology. And I think in the Every Moment Holy books, the prayers that I've written over the last 8 years, much of what I'm doing there, even the overall premise of it, goes back to that idea of coram Deo that Charlie was talking a lot about in those first couple of years of the art house.
Yeah, I actually have them right here on my shelf because I use them in class. But Every Moment Holy, for those people who don't know, I was thinking it's funny you said Rabbit Room has a publishing wing, to publish stuff that the big publishers wouldn't touch, and I'm thinking they probably would touch them now, because as far as I can tell, they've sold really well.
Yeah, it's been surprising. They've. When I wrote them, the first prayer that I wrote that ended up in volume 1, I wrote for myself because it was something I needed. But then the idea almost immediately expanded, but it was into something that I thought, I think there's something here that will resonate with the Rabbit Room community, which was maybe, 6,000 people or so in terms of those who are engaging in some way with the Rabbit Room organization. I didn't know beyond that whether it would have resonance or not. So there's a sense in which I feel kind of detached from it, because the response to it has been so out of proportion to anything that I know that I was capable of bringing to it, that there is this detachment that I make allusion to maybe in the introduction to volume 3, but I've so often just identified with that little kid in the Gospels who showed up to hear this preacher preach, with his, few little fishes and loaves that his mom had probably stuck in the basket for him for his lunch. And that kid, gives that little bit that he has, but then he watches as Christ blesses it and breaks it and multiplies it and distributes it, for the feeding of all these people. And I don't think the kid ever thought, I did that.
Right.
So it's just this sometimes mystifying kind of thing when stories filter back of, a couple days ago, someone was telling me that they were speaking to someone that they know in Myanmar.
Oh, wow.
Who was telling them about these Every Moment Holy books that they use almost every day and how, formational they've been. And there's, I think more than anything, my response is, it's humbling, but there's also sometimes this little bit of a, when you're driving on the interstate and you start to change lanes and then you hear a horn, someone laying on the horn, and you look and you see someone was in your blind spot and you jerk the wheel back over. And then for the next several miles, your heart's just beating really fast and all you can think about is what you might have caused there, how close you came. And so when I see what looks to me like that God has been pleased to multiply and use these prayers in these books in a way that's beyond anything I could even delude myself that I had contributed. What I do know is how easily I could have not written them. How over the years that I spent writing them, it was such a struggle and such a fight just to bring myself, day by day, even sometimes hour by hour, or, even in 5-minute increments, to bring myself back to it, to try again, to do this thing that even then I knew I couldn't make it what I wanted it to be, what my vision for it was. My ongoing prayer was that God would show up somewhere in the process, would meet me in the midst of my weakness, and would make the whole more than the sum of the parts that I could bring to it. But there were so many times when I could have so easily just given up, right? But, even that, I suppose, is a testament to the way that God, if we put various scriptures together, and we can see that God prepares good works in advance for us to do, and he prepares us for the doing of them, and then he is the one who brings them to completion.
Yeah.
Right? So,
and all we have to do is walk, right? Walk in those things.
Yeah, or just keep not saying no.
Yeah.
Right? That's how it feels to me sometimes.
Yeah. I feel like my life has been stumbling backwards into all kinds of opportunities where I could potentially create disasters for other people, which scares me. I think I can imagine what you said about Charlie Peacock is the way a lot of people feel about these books. Even my charismatic, non-denominational stepmother, who doesn't really have a liturgical bone in her body. I turned her on to these books, and she loves them. She reads every family gathering now. We're reading Every Moment Holy. She gives them to people as gifts. So I think it tapped into something that a lot of people hadn't experienced in their prayer life, which is that kind of raw, open psalmic, lament, the lament that ends with "Why God, why," rather than "But I trust in you, Lord" kind of moments. And I think Stanley Hauerwas has modeled, I don't know if you've seen his Prayers Plainly Spoken, but he's kind of modeled some of this. They're much shorter prayers, but they're just that kind of modeling that open, prophetic, I don't know what you're doing, God, or help me in this moment. So I can very easily see why that kind of very honest, high integrity appeals to people. Also, I'm so glad to hear you say how terrified you are about the effects of all of this, because I've written a little bit on ritual, and I spent a few years kind of researching ritual in the Bible, like how the biblical authors thought about ritual and how they employ it. And And then I wrote a popular book about ritual. And one of the things that, as I was kind of puzzling through how do you deal with all the rituals that happen in churches, all the different ways churches do the same rituals. And, like once you start thinking about ritual, you can't stop seeing it everywhere kind of a thing. But one of the things that struck me was how little attention people give to all the rituals that they're prescribing to people around each other. Even little things like a pastor saying, "Hey, can raise your hands while I pray," or just little things when we're asking people to do things with their bodies, which is anytime we're asking somebody to do something, there just seems to be no fear and trembling in the construction of the ritual. We just kind of go for it, and then, oops, that didn't work, or it turns, and then that ritual gets programmatized, and we can't change it because that's what the church has always done. And you're like, but it's a bad ritual, or it's flimsy, or it's vapid. And as Stanley Hauerwas also says, is it all starts with you pray some meaningless prayer, and then you're singing some sappy worship song, and the next thing you know, you killed your brother. And I put that quote on the front of my Old Testament syllabuses, and I always think like there's something really to that, where he's really actually trying to draw us back to the fear and trembling we should bring to those little rituals we're prescribing. So I wonder, having said all of that, if there's any part of Every Moment Holy where you're like, ooh, I don't know if I should have told people to pray that. Not asking for any juicy tidbits. I'm just wondering if there's anything that gave you pause when you were writing it or in looking back.
Well, the first things that come to mind are just maybe more anecdotal. I mean, one is that in volume 1 of the earlier prayers that I wrote, as I was kind of still experimenting with the form, trying to find it, I, at a certain point, included the instruction in the middle of the prayer that I can't remember how I described it, but the petitioner may now strike themselves lightly on the.
I remember this one, yeah,
and it might have only made it through the first couple printings before the publisher and I were like, let's just get rid of that.
Really? So now we know if we have a first press edition or not.
Right.
Okay.
Self-flagellation.
And then
also in the first edition, in the final prayer, which is a liturgy of praise to Christ, the King of Creation, or a liturgy of praise to the King of Creation. Between the first and the second printings, I made a significant edit on the refrain. Originally, it said, and that prayer, for people who aren't familiar with it, is kind of this poetic praise of, it's unpacking what it means that Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Right? It's like, yes, he is that, but that also gets worked out in the particulars.
Right.
He is, so it becomes sort of this wild romp of celebratory praise, looking at all of creation, that, that he's not just the God of everything. That means he's specifically the God of, the things on the quantum level and things on the, on the planetary and universal level, and of, not just all of the animals in general, but of each kind of animal in particular as well, that kingship and lordship gets worked out in the details.
Very Colossians 1.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the way I had phrased it in the first edition was, our names for you have been too few. And I think that works fine for something that's a poem.
Mm.
But for something that's actually liturgy, there's a different criteria. There's a more stringent criteria, because you don't want to be asking people to be praying something corporately together, to be giving voice to it, but to have to be trying to do the work of connecting the dots between these abstractions. There's more of a responsibility there. And so, there was a pastor that I was an acquaintance of who made the point that that we don't have the right to name God, right? That he defines himself, he names himself. And I could have made that argument that, well, I don't mean that, we're coming up with the names of God. What we're doing is unpacking the implications of the names God has given himself. But it was a caution that deserved some consideration. And so after doing so, because of the nature of what I think liturgy should do, as opposed to something that's just poetry, even though liturgy can be beautiful and poetic, it serves a different purpose from something that's just purely poetry. So I changed it to, our thoughts of you have been too small, too few. So from the second printing onward, it's been that refrain.
We're getting the collector's editions now.
Yeah.
You're going to find these first prints on eBay soon, and somebody negotiating. They're trading a fireplace for a first edition.
Right.
I actually picked up volume 2 first. That's how I came into it. And this is on Death, Dying, Grief. I think it's
Death, Grief, and Hope.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we should put hope. But when good news is bad, for seasons of uncertainty, before medical treatment, intercession for one who is slowly losing bodily functions, or function, I should say here, to the caregivers for the rest, on dying well. There's a whole host there. And I think when you read these prayers, I didn't need to hear you say what you just said to figure out that there was great care taken in the wording and the phrasing and the length and the pace of these prayers. I think they, it's like, I don't know if you'll take this as an insult or not. It's like modern hymn writers, right? I mean, there's something like about the particulars. There that mix of particular and universal that happens here that becomes almost, sacramental in some moment. And I mean that as somebody who hates the word sacramental. So for all kinds of weird, pedantic reasons. But it does become oddly sacramental. So I know on behalf of thousands and thousands of people, are greatly appreciative that you did muscle through 5 minutes at a time, an hour at a time, and a day at a time to get these written down. What else from the Rabbit Room would you commend to people, your work or others?
Well, I would encourage people to go to rabbitroom.com, and then you can click on the bookstore option to see all of the different books that Rabbit Room publishes, and there are dozens of those now. There's fiction and nonfiction, but there are also the books that Rabbit Room Press curates, right? That they think if you appreciate what Rabbit Room publishes, then these are also books by other authors we think you might be interested in. So they've always had a very generous kind of stance in that regard. And Andrew Peterson is remarkable in that respect, his generosity to other artists and how he's constantly elevating other people on the stage, or, in the various media conversations he has, that he's always, trying to open the door wider for his friends.
That's nice.
And that philosophy has definitely carried through the organization in many different ways. But Yeah, as to specific recommendations, I mean, it depends so much. They have such a wide variety of books now. It would depend so much on what someone likes. They no longer publish Andrew's Wingfeather Saga fantasy series. That is all 4 of those books plus a collection of short stories are published by Waterbrook Press now. But they still sell them, and those for families, I mean, those are just tremendous read-alouds, and well-loved. They've sold over 1 million copies of those.
Holy cow. I've never even heard of them.
Yeah, and they're actually in production on season 3 of what is expected to be a 7-season animated series. So seasons 1 and 2 of those books are available to stream now. So I would. I'm actually the worst person to ask for recommendations on anything, because I can almost never think of any. When someone says, "What are your favorite movies?" I'm like, what are the titles of any movies I've ever seen?
I just emailed someone today saying they were asking me for a few books on a topic. I was like, I can't. You have to give me 3 weeks and get back to me. And I'm sure I know a lot of books on that topic. I just can't think of a single one today. Right. So I like to abuse other people, because some people are good at that, Well, Doug McKelvey, thank you so much for your work, the work of the Rabbit Room, and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Drew. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.